The ambulance sped through the narrow streets, sirens blaring and lights flashing, shattering the evening's quiet. Inside, Jessica lay on a stretcher, her face contorted with pain as another powerful contraction hit. She gripped her husband Daniel's hand tightly, her knuckles turning white from the strain. Leaning close, Daniel tried to keep his voice calm, though worry churned inside him. "It's going to be okay, Jessica," he said, gently brushing her sweat-drenched hair. "We're almost there, just hold on a little longer." She managed a weak smile between her pains, exhaling heavily. "Tell that to the baby," Jessica murmured, attempting to keep her tone light, though her voice was frail. The paramedic, Tom, sitting nearby, offered her an encouraging smile. Turning from his seat up front, he said, "Just a few more minutes, and we'll be at County General Hospital. Hang in there, Miss Jessica." His eyes shone with calm confidence, helping to ease some of the tension in the cramped ambulance space. Tom had been doing this job for years, and tonight he wouldn't allow himself to lose that steadiness, especially with this family in need. "A few minutes feels like a lifetime," Jessica managed to say, but her voice choked off as another contraction clenched her abdomen. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Tom looked at her reassuringly. "You're doing great. Just take deep breaths, slowly in and out." Jessica followed his advice, taking deep breaths and clutching Daniel's hand even tighter. Daniel watched her, feeling each groan and every labored breath as though they were knives twisting in his chest. His eyes reddened with worry and helplessness. He glanced at Tom, his eyes pleading as if to ask if they would make it in time. Tom caught his gaze and nodded confidently, reassuring Daniel and offering a spark of hope amid the tense moment. "County General is ready for us," Tom added, his voice steady. "They have a delivery room and medical team prepared for Ms. Jessica the moment we arrive." Daniel leaned close to Jessica, speaking softly. "Listen, love, we're in the hands of the best. Just a few more minutes." Jessica looked at him, trying to stay calm, but another stronger contraction hit, forcing her to bite down hard on her lip to keep from screaming. Her hand gripped his so tightly that Daniel felt a sharp pain, but he didn't let go. His heart pounded in his chest, filled with worry and a sense of helplessness. Suddenly, the ambulance slowed down abruptly. Jessica and Daniel looked at each other in surprise, a flicker of worry crossing their faces. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, his voice edged with anxiety. Tom felt uneasy as well. He leaned toward the window to get a better view ahead. The flashing lights of a police car illuminated the windshield, creating an unexpected, baffling scene as the ambulance came to a complete stop. Outside, darkness surrounded everything except for the flashing lights, and a police officer stepped out of the patrol car, exuding authority and seriousness. His shadow loomed against the ambulance's window, casting a strange, foreboding presence. Tom looked through the windshield, his heart pounding. He glanced back at Daniel and Jessica, striving to keep his voice steady despite his unease. Jessica lay on the stretcher, her face pale with pain and worry. Daniel, beside her, stared forward, clearly bewildered as to why they had stopped. Tom knew that time was critical in a situation like this, and he had not a moment to spare. "Stay calm," he said quietly to Daniel and Jessica. "Let me step out and see what's going on. This is probably just a misunderstanding." With that, Tom lowered the window as the officer approached. He tried to keep his voice calm and composed, though he couldn't shake the uneasiness brewing inside him at this unexpected situation. Standing outside the vehicle, the police officer wore a stern expression, his cap pulled low, obscuring the upper half of his face, revealing only his cold eyes that seemed to pierce through the tense atmosphere inside. "Is there a problem, officer?" Tom tried to keep his voice calm, though he could feel the tension of the situation. The officer, Officer Barnes, looked down at Tom, his arms folded across his chest. "What's the reason you sped and ran the red light?" he asked, his tone unfriendly. Suspicion was evident in Barnes's eyes, and Tom could sense the tension between them growing. "Officer, we're transporting a patient in labor," Tom replied, attempting to emphasize the urgency of the situation. "We need to get her to County General Hospital as quickly as possible." Barnes frowned as if pondering something. "A red light is a red light," he said coldly. "I saw you just run the light at the previous intersection. Even if it's an ambulance, you're still bound by traffic laws." Tom struggled to stay calm, but his voice grew more tense as he spoke. Officer, this is an emergency. According to regulations, an ambulance has the right to run red lights when responding to an emergency with lights and siren activated. Barnes gave a faint, unsympathetic smile. The law is still the law. You can't just do whatever you want by turning on your lights, he replied firmly. I need to see your driver's license and vehicle registration. In the back seat, Daniel seemed unable to hold back his frustration. Leaning forward, his voice shook with anger. Are you serious? My wife is in critical condition and we need to get to the hospital, not stand here arguing over paperwork. Barnes stared coldly at Daniel and ordered, Sit down and be quiet. I'm talking to the paramedic here. Tom looked at Daniel, gently signaling him to stay calm. But inside, Tom felt his patience wearing thin. He understood Jessica's condition was critical, and every moment's delay could lead to serious consequences. Officer, we don't have time for this. Every second is crucial for the patient, Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady, though he couldn't shake the feeling of fear inside. Barnes raised an eyebrow, looking dissatisfied with Tom's response. Your story means nothing to me, Barnes replied curtly. License and registration, or I'll keep you here until everything is thoroughly checked. In the back of the ambulance, Jessica grew weaker by the moment. Her contractions were becoming more frequent, making it impossible for her to hold on any longer. Sweat beaded on her forehead and her eyes blurred with pain. She reached out, trying to regain Daniel's attention, her voice faint and trembling. Daniel, please, I need to get to the hospital. Desperation and anger surged through Daniel as he saw his wife's deteriorating condition. Unable to bear it any longer, he turned to Barnes, shouting, Do you understand what's happening? My wife could die if we don't leave right now. Barnes merely looked at Daniel coldly, unmoved. Suddenly, he flung the ambulance door open and stepped inside, his sudden movement causing Tom to step back instinctively, hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. Hey, calm down, officer. We're just trying to do our job, Tom said, trying to keep his composure while his worried gaze shifted back to Jessica. Barnes said nothing, but his eyes were filled with hostility and anger. Without warning, Barnes swung his fist, landing a punch directly on Tom's face, sending him staggering backward, his head striking the medical cabinet. A sharp pain shot through his jaw, and the metallic taste of blood filled Tom's mouth. He struggled to keep calm, not wanting things to spiral out of control. Tom! Daniel shouted, horrified at seeing the paramedic attacked. He angrily stood up, lunging toward Barnes to intervene, but Jessica weakly grasped his arm, her voice faint. Daniel, don't. Stay calm. Tom staggered to his feet, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth. He tried to regain his composure and pleaded with Barnes. Officer, please, let us go. Her condition is severe. This isn't about you or me. It's about her life. Barnes sneered, though his expression revealed a hint of inner conflict, as if he was struggling with himself. However, his gaze still showed no hint of sympathy. The shouting and protests from Daniel and Tom quickly drew the attention of passers-by. Soon, a crowd gathered around the ambulance and Officer Barnes's patrol car. Seeing Jessica lying in pain on the stretcher, combined with Barnes's aggressive and unreasonable behavior, the crowd grew increasingly angry. Many people began recording the tense scene on their phones, with the red and blue lights from the patrol car and ambulance casting angry reflections on their faces. She needs to get to the hospital. Let them go, a woman in the crowd yelled, her voice full of worry and frustration. This is an ambulance, not a race car. Why are you blocking them? A young man demanded angrily, his gaze piercing toward the ambulance. His indignation spread through the crowd, fueling their anger over Barnes's irresponsible conduct. Can't you see she's in pain? An older man shouted, his face flushed with anger. The crowd grew more indignant, with many moving closer to the ambulance, trying to make Officer Barnes understand that they disagreed with how he was handling the situation. Officer Barnes glanced at the crowd, his face full of irritation. Their resistance made him lose his composure, but instead of yielding, he became even more stubborn. He raised his chin defiantly, yelling, "Back off! This is police business. You have no right to interfere." However, the crowd did not back down. Instead, they grew louder, demanding that Barnes let the ambulance proceed. A woman stepped closer, holding up her phone to record and speaking loudly. Everyone can see what's happening. We won't let this go. Around her, people chanted, expressing their anger, supporting Jessica and condemning Barnes's actions. Each individual in the crowd now became part of a united force, demanding humanity and fairness. An elderly man stepped forward, his voice resolute. "We have rights too. This is a matter of basic decency, officer. Step aside and let her receive the care she needs." Barnes gradually felt the pressure from the crowd, and his irritation began turning to confusion and unease. He was no longer just dealing with Daniel and Tom. He was facing a crowd ready to stand against him. His authority, which had always been respected, was now being openly challenged, and he began to realize he no longer controlled the situation. "Get back, all of you!" Barnes shouted, but his voice no longer carried the authority it once had. The crowd sensed the wavering in his voice and continued their chants, drowning him out. Someone from the back yelled, "We're all recording this. Everyone will see how you're treating someone in need." A young mother holding her child stepped closer, her face determined. "What if that were your sister or your wife? Would you want them to be held back like this?" Her words struck a chord with those around her, and the crowd nodded in agreement. Many people held up their phones, capturing every movement of Barnes. And the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. With each passing second, the pressure from the crowd mounted. Barnes looked around, clearly seeing the resolute expressions and phone cameras pointed at him. He knew that any violent action now would only worsen the situation, and he began to feel the weight of his responsibility to the public. Another voice called out from the crowd, "Show some compassion, officer. Let the ambulance go." Clearly, everyone, including Barnes, could see that he was losing the crowd's support. Confronted with the unwavering resolve of the people and the fact that Jessica was in severe pain and needed urgent care, his authority could not overpower the strength of their solidarity and compassion. Slowly, Barnes's face turned weary, but the crowd remained steadfast in demanding he do the right thing. In that tense moment, the crowd's spirit of unity and compassion shone, serving as a testament to the power of solidarity in standing up for justice and kindness. At that moment, the sound of sirens from other approaching patrol cars echoed from afar. 2 more police vehicles arrived at the scene, their lights flashing, signaling the arrival of backup. The crowd quickly noticed and stepped back slightly, making way for the patrol cars. The door of the first car opened, and a tall, gray-haired officer stepped out, Captain Ramirez. His demeanor was stern, his face cold but exuding authority, and the crowd gradually fell silent. Captain Ramirez walked over, his sharp gaze scanning the crowd before settling on Officer Barnes. He assessed the situation carefully, taking in the recording phones, the shocked faces of the people, and Tom with a visible bruise from Barnes's punch. Jessica was still lying on the stretcher, her face pale and weak, while Daniel sat beside her, his eyes full of anger and despair. "Barnes, what's going on here?" Captain Ramirez shouted, his deep voice full of authority, leaving no room for excuses. Barnes straightened up, trying to regain his composure, though he was unsettled by the captain's presence. "Sir, this ambulance ran a red light. I was just following protocol, checking their documents to ensure everything was in order," Barnes tried to explain, his voice trembling. Ramirez looked at Barnes with a disapproving gaze, then turned to the ambulance. He saw Tom standing there with a pained expression, and Jessica writhing on the stretcher, her eyes glazed with pain, her breath coming in weak gasps. The crowd looked to him with hope, waiting for a fair decision to release Jessica from this ordeal. "Barnes, you're obstructing an ambulance in an emergency, and not only that, you're endangering the lives of a mother and child. Do you realize the serious consequences your actions could lead to?" Ramirez said, his voice laced with sternness. Barnes faltered, opening his mouth as if to say something, but then fell silent, seeing Ramirez's steely gaze. A hint of embarrassment and confusion flickered in Barnes' eyes, and he looked down, avoiding his captain's stare. Ramirez sighed, then turned to the crowd gathered around. "Everyone, please remain calm. We will handle this situation immediately," he said, his tone authoritative but also reassuring. The crowd quieted down, watching Ramirez intently to see how he would proceed. He turned back to Barnes, his voice cold and decisive. "Barnes, step away from the ambulance and let them... That's a direct order." Barnes stood frozen for a moment, his eyes filled with anger and resentment, but it was clear he dared not resist. Ramirez's determination left Barnes with no choice. Finally, Barnes stepped back, allowing the ambulance to pass, his eyes still cold but unable to hide his defeat and frustration. "Thank heavens they can finally go," someone in the crowd exclaimed. and the crowd began cheering as the ambulance prepared to resume its journey. Several people held up their phones, capturing the moment Ramirez ordered Barnes to back down, a symbolic act of justice being served. Ramirez nodded encouragingly to Tom and Daniel, his gaze softening as he looked at them. "Go ahead, get her to the hospital right away. Good luck," Ramirez said, his voice filled with encouragement and seriousness. Tom quickly resumed his seat, and the ambulance rolled away from the scene, its sirens echoing through the harsh, dark streets. Daniel squeezed Jessica's hand, whispering to her that they had overcome a difficult hurdle and would soon be safe. As the ambulance departed, the crowd clapped and cheered, showing their support for Captain Ramirez's decision. Ramirez stood there watching the ambulance fade into the distance before turning back to Barnes, his gaze shifting to one of stern disapproval. "We'll discuss your actions today later, Barnes," he said in a low voice, thick with disappointment. Barnes stood motionless, his face flushed, his eyes downcast. It was clear he understood that his actions had crossed a line, and he now had to face the consequences of his decisions. When the ambulance stopped at the gates of County General Hospital, the medical team was already prepared, quickly moving Jessica into the emergency room. Everything happened in a whirlwind. Nurses rushed the stretcher down the brightly lit hallway, with Tom and Daniel following closely, their eyes never leaving Jessica's still form. Her face pale, her body was exhausted, her breathing labored, and each wave of pain seemed to be another battle she had to endure. Dr. Mitchell, an experienced obstetrician, immediately arrived to assess the situation. He quickly recognized that Jessica's condition had worsened due to the delay. Signaling to the team, he directed them to take Jessica into the operating room immediately. "The baby's heartbeat is weakening. We're out of time. We need to perform surgery right away," he said, his tone calm yet urgent. Daniel stood outside the operating room, feeling both dazed and heartbroken as he processed these words. Through the glass doors, he could see the doctors urgently preparing Jessica for surgery. Each second dragged on, feeling like an eternity. Each one torturous as the image of Barnes and his cold, unfeeling actions replayed in his mind. He quickly dialed his father-in-law, his voice steady but unable to conceal the worry rising within him. "Dad, something terrible has happened." On the other end, Richard Grant responded with his usual calm. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Daniel's voice was choked with emotion and anger. "Dad, something awful happened. Jessica was held up on the way to the hospital." Richard sat up, his heart tightening at Daniel's words. "What do you mean? Is Jessica all right?" "She's at the hospital, but a police officer named Barnes stopped the ambulance. He punched the paramedic, pushed me out, and refused to let the ambulance go. We were stuck for nearly 20 minutes, Richard. I'm afraid that delay has affected Jessica's condition." Richard's anger flared like fire as he gripped the phone tightly. "A police officer stopped an ambulance?" His voice dropped, filled with anger. "Who was he?" "His name is Barnes," Daniel replied, nearly gritting his teeth as he spoke the officer's name. "A pompous cop who thought he was more important than the emergency at hand. If the backup hadn't arrived, I don't know what else he would have done to us." An uncontainable fury rose within Richard, his hand clenching around the phone. "Officer Barnes? He dared to stop an emergency ambulance?" His voice was cold and filled with rage. "How could he do such a thing?" "Yes, Barnes," Daniel said, filled with seething anger. As a district attorney and a protective father, Richard understood the gravity of the situation. He swallowed his anger and made a resolute promise. "Barnes will face the consequences of his actions. He put Jessica, your wife, and my grandchild in an unacceptable situation." After a moment of tense silence, Richard spoke, his voice both cold and determined. "Stay at the hospital. I'll be there shortly." Hanging up, Richard stood with a rare decisiveness. He knew this wasn't just about justice for Jessica, but a mission to protect his family, a confrontation he wouldn't stop until Barnes was held accountable. He got into his car immediately and headed for the hospital. Walking through the double doors, his anxious gaze swept the crowded waiting area until it rested on Daniel, who was pacing near the reception desk, his face haggard and marked with bruises. When Daniel saw Richard, the tension on his face gave way to a mixture of relief and pain as he walked quickly toward his father-in-law. "Richard," Daniel called out, his voice heavy with pain and exhaustion. The look in Daniel's eyes conveyed a hint of what he had endured, fueling Richard's simmering anger. "What happened to you?" Richard asked, his voice low and tense, though his eyes showed clear concern at the sight of the cut on Daniel's cheek, and the heavy toll he was bearing. That officer was horrendous, Daniel choked out, his voice tinged with bitterness and frustration. He didn't care at all about what we were saying, like he didn't want to listen to a word. I tried to explain and begged him to let us go, but the more I spoke, the angrier he got, like he wanted to take all his spite out on us. He was completely out of control. Richard clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he tried to hold back his anger. "This is unbelievable," he murmured, his voice filled with anger and frustration. Daniel looked down, his voice quiet, like a sigh from an exhausted soul. Jessica begged him for help. She could barely breathe, but he just stood there, watching us in pain like it was nothing. That moment, a nurse approached, interrupting their conversation. "Mr. Grant," she said softly, her gaze shifting over the tense faces of both men, "the doctor will be out soon to update you on their condition. Please bear with us a little longer." Daniel nodded, though it was clear he couldn't stand still. His gaze kept returning to the long hallway ahead, his eyes filled with tension and pain as if hoping to see Jessica safely come out. Richard stood beside him, feeling helpless. He wished he could do something to ease his son-in-law's suffering and protect his family, but all he could do now was wait, anxious and hopeful that justice and conscience would prevail. A few minutes later, a doctor in a blue coat entered the waiting area, his face serious. He looked around briefly and then walked toward Richard and Daniel. Both father and son-in-law immediately turned, their eyes full of worry. "Mr. Daniel?" "Mr. Grant," the doctor said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm Dr. Mitchell, the one overseeing the emergency procedure for your wife and child." Daniel struggled to find his words, his voice shaking. "How are they, doctor?" Dr. Mitchell looked at Daniel with a reassuring expression but couldn't hide his tension. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, speaking slowly and gravely. "Your wife has encountered serious complications. Her blood pressure spiked due to the stress and delay, impacting the oxygen flow to the baby. We have to proceed with surgery now to save them both." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Everything felt like a nightmare, and he could only stand in silence, watching as Dr. Mitchell disappeared through the doors of the operating room, praying for Jessica and his child. Within him was a mix of anxiety, anger, and helplessness. He couldn't believe that because of Barnes's unreasonable interference, his family's life was now hanging by a thread. Daniel slumped, relief mixed with worry clear in his eyes. He looked at Richard, who stood steadfast but with a visible tension he couldn't hide. Richard grasped his son-in-law's hand firmly, his gaze full of determination. "This could all have been avoided," Richard said, his voice low but charged with deep anger. "That officer will pay for what he's done." Daniel nodded, his voice choked. "We can't let this be forgotten. Without that delay, Jessica and our child might not have been in danger." Richard placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice firm. "I'll make sure he faces the consequences. He won't escape this." After Dr. Mitchell left, Richard and Daniel sat silently in the waiting area, each lost in their thoughts. Part of them worried for Jessica and the baby, while another part was filled with anger over what they had endured. Richard couldn't stop thinking about how to hold Barnes accountable. He resolved not to stop at merely filing a complaint, but to do everything necessary to see justice served. In the operating room, doctors and nurses worked in a tense atmosphere. The surgical lights illuminated the entire room, and Dr. Mitchell directed every step, wasting no time. Jessica lay motionless on the operating table, her breaths faint, and the baby's heartbeat seemed to weaken with each beat. Every beat was like a ticking clock, a race against time to save 2 lives. Outside in the hallway, Daniel couldn't sit still. His eyes were fixed on the operating room doors, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and anger. He replayed every detail of his confrontation with Barnes, the cold, unfeeling look in his eyes, the brutal punch to Tom, and the sheer absurdity of blocking an emergency ambulance. Each image made Daniel's blood boil, and he felt a deep ache in his heart. He wondered how could a police officer, someone meant to protect citizens, act so cruelly. Time dragged on slowly until at last the operating room doors opened. Dr. Mitchell stepped out, his face weary and tense, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He approached Richard and Daniel, who immediately stood up when they saw the doctor. "Both mother and baby are out of immediate danger," Dr. Mitchell said, his voice calm but filled with empathy. "However, their condition is still precarious. The baby was born prematurely, so we'll need to keep him in an incubator for a while. Jessica suffered significant trauma and will need time to recover. Without timely surgery, things could have been much worse. Daniel heard these words as if a weight had just been lifted from his chest. He collapsed back into his seat, exhaling deeply, though his eyes remained red, filled with both relief and lingering pain. He felt immense gratitude that his wife and the son had been saved, but also profound sorrow and rage at the reality that due to a police officer's abuse of power and lack of empathy, his family had been forced into such a tragic ordeal. Richard stood silently beside Daniel, his heart clenched as he listened to Dr. Mitchell's update on Jessica and his newborn grandson. The doctor's words offered some hope, but also layered on more heartache. His daughter, the strong woman he had always been proud of, now lay weak, needing a long time to recover, while his fragile grandson had to fight for every breath in an incubator. Richard clenched his fists, holding back tears, but the shock and pain were evident in his eyes. Hearing Daniel's relieved sigh, Richard wanted to share in that rare moment of calm, but his pain and outrage surged within him. He felt powerless, a foreign feeling for a father who had always done everything to protect and care for his daughter. But this time, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop Jessica from enduring this needless suffering. Richard couldn't understand why his family had been thrown into this nightmare, all because of a tyrannical, unfeeling police officer. His quiet anger threatened to explode, but he knew he had to stay composed for Daniel, Jessica, and the newborn baby. His heart ached as he thought of Jessica, the daughter he had cherished since she was small, now bearing such heavy injuries in this senseless injustice. Richard placed a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder, giving a gentle squeeze and silent encouragement. He knew they were both wrestling with deep pain and unspoken anger. Looking into Daniel's red-rimmed eyes, Richard felt more than ever the pain and responsibility of a father. He silently promised himself that he would not let this tragedy be forgotten, and he would do everything he could to demand justice for Jessica and protect their family from further harm. Later, Daniel walked over to the intensive care unit, where Jessica was resting in her weakened state, and his son lay in the incubator. Through the transparent glass, he saw his tiny son, fragile, sleeping peacefully, each breath supported by the machines around him. His heart ached as he thought of the dangerous journey his child had endured, even before birth. Jessica was still unconscious, her face pale, though her breathing had stabilized. Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand, feeling her soft but cold skin. He took a deep breath, feeling a wave of pain and fury. He recalled every detail of his confrontation with Barnes, every brutal and indifferent act the officer had committed in blocking the ambulance when his family needed urgent care. A fierce, unprecedented anger rose within him, but it was also filled with determination. He leaned down and whispered in Jessica's ear, "I promise you, justice will be served. I won't let anyone cause this pain without facing the consequences." Sitting silently in the quiet of the hospital room, Daniel resolved to fight until Barnes's actions were brought to light. That officer would be held accountable, and justice would be served. He knew this was not only for Jessica and their son, but also for every innocent person who might suffer from the same abuse of power his family had endured. Returning to his office, Richard Grant quickly summoned his legal team to the conference room. In the tense atmosphere of the emergency meeting, Richard stood at the center, his gaze sharp and his stance determined. His staff sat around the table, awaiting his words. Opposite him sat Charles, a former detective known for his investigative prowess, his eyes focused and ready. Richard looked directly at Charles, his voice firm and resolute. "Charles, I need you to find every bit of information you can on a police officer named Barnes from Precinct." Charles leaned forward, nodding. "Barnes? What happened, Richard?" he asked, his tone serious, with a note of genuine concern. Richard held back his simmering anger. "That officer blocked my daughter's ambulance while she was being rushed to the hospital," he said heavily. "Not only did he obstruct it, but he also assaulted the paramedic, threatened my son-in-law, delayed the emergency response, putting both Jessica and my newborn grandson in danger. I need to know if this was an isolated abuse of power or part of a larger pattern." The room fell silent, no one daring to breathe too loudly. The gravity of the situation was evident to everyone. Charles met Richard's gaze, nodding with steely determination. "Understood, Richard. I'll get on it right away. If there's a history of abuse, I'll uncover it all. Richard nodded, his expression unwavering. Good. I want every piece of information you can find on my desk as soon as possible. Leave nothing out. Charles nodded, his gaze intense. You'll have it all, Richard. That officer won't have a single secret left by the time I'm through. A few staff members around the table nodded in agreement, with one adding, We're here to support you, Charles. Just let us know what you need. Richard cast a stern gaze around the room, his voice filled with authority and resolve. Everyone, this isn't just personal. It's a mission to uphold justice. Barnes won't get away with what he's done without paying a price. We won't allow those who abuse power to keep endangering innocent people. Let's bring the truth to light. The atmosphere in the conference room became one of determination and unity. Everyone understood that they were not merely spectators. They would stand with Richard to ensure justice for his family and make sure that Officer Barnes faced consequences for his actions. Immediately afterward, Charles and the legal team began delving into Barnes's record. 2 days later, Richard received an email from Charles with the simple subject line, Report on Barnes. He opened the attached document, his sharp gaze skimming over each line of information Charles had meticulously gathered. With every word he read, Richard's expression darkened, and his anger simmered as he uncovered the details of Barnes's record, full of misconduct. Barnes had a notorious past, numerous complaints of excessive force, verbal abuse, intimidation, and even allegations of assault. All these cases had either been quietly settled or dismissed for lack of evidence, allowing him to keep his position without facing any penalties. This kind of impunity could only happen if someone within the system was protecting Barnes, enabling him to continue his wrongful actions without consequences. Richard clenched his fist as he read the final lines. Barnes hadn't just targeted the defenseless, those who couldn't retaliate or report him, but had actively abused his power to suppress anyone who dared to stand up. This was a betrayal of the role he had been entrusted with. Barnes couldn't be allowed to continue without facing justice. Richard immediately called Charles. Charles, this is more than enough, Richard said, his voice steady but filled with restrained anger. Send everything you've got on Barnes to my office right away. I want to make this public. What he's done must be brought before the law, and I want everyone to know who he is. Charles hesitated slightly. The media won't let this go quietly, Richard. Are you sure you want to create such a big wave? Without a moment's hesitation, Richard replied, I'm certain. Barnes is a danger not only to my family, but to the entire community. It's time for the truth to come out. Later that day, Richard assembled his legal team in his office. Serious faces surrounded the large conference table, each person feeling the weight and seriousness of the case as Richard laid out the details. We will pursue criminal charges against Officer Barnes, Richard began, his voice firm and resolute. With the evidence in our hands, we will charge him with assault, obstruction of emergency medical services, endangerment, and abuse of power. This is about justice not only for my family, but for everyone who has suffered under his misconduct. Grace, one of his senior attorneys, nodded in agreement. With the evidence we've gathered, we can build a strong case. The footage from bystanders, the paramedic's testimony, and previous complaints will highlight his unfitness as a police officer. Richard nodded, his gaze cold and determined. I want every action he took that night scrutinized, and I want his past misconduct to be exposed in court. Barnes must be held accountable for it all. Thomas, another attorney on the team, added, we should also consider civil charges such as intentional infliction of emotional distress and gross negligence. This will reinforce the criminal charges and ensure he can't escape responsibility. Richard turned to Thomas, his gaze firm. Yes, bring both sets of charges. I want his badge revoked, and I want him to face the full consequences of his actions. And not just Barnes. I want those who covered for him within the department to be held accountable too. Richard's determination and sense of justice filled the room. He knew this was not just a legal battle against one individual, but a declaration against a flawed system that had allowed Barnes's abuse of power. With every ounce of his strength and resolve, he would ensure that his family and any other innocent people would not have to suffer the same harm. The next morning, the story of the ambulance incident involving Jessica quickly became the focal point in newspapers and across social media. Headlines like, Police Officer Blocks Ambulance, Endangering Lives of Mother and Child in Emergency, appeared in major publications, sparking a powerful public reaction. The articles revealed details of Barnes's history of abuse of power, along with numerous complaints against him that had been hidden or dismissed. The public's response was intense and swift. Hundreds expressed outrage on social media, condemning the abuse of power and calling for immediate disciplinary action against the officer. Hashtags like Justice for Jessica and Stop Abuse of Power quickly spread, drawing thousands of shares and comments. The community demanded transparency and fairness in the case, urging police reform to ensure no one could evade accountability for abuse of power. Sensing the strength of public opinion, Richard decided to hold a press conference. He wanted to make a public statement, not only to ensure justice for his family, but also to set a deterrent precedent. At the press conference, he stepped up to the podium with a serious expression and a determined gaze. Reporters had gathered in large numbers, and millions were watching live. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice strong and clear. "This case is not just a personal incident. It is a prime example of abuse of power that has gone unchecked for too long in the system. Officer Barnes not only endangered the lives of my daughter and grandson, but is a threat to every citizen in this community." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I am committed to seeing this case through to the end. Not only will Barnes be held accountable, but everyone who has enabled or concealed his abuse of power will also face justice. This is not only justice for my family, but for the entire community." Richard's statement struck a powerful chord with those who had protected Barnes. The press conference quickly went viral, and his courageous actions inspired many others. Human rights organizations and civil rights attorneys joined the cause, creating a movement calling for police reform. Back in his office, Richard and his team immediately began building the legal case against Barnes. They gathered and compiled all necessary evidence, including videos recorded by bystanders that day, testimonies from paramedics in the ambulance, and statements from witnesses in the crowd. Every detail was carefully reviewed, and the case file became increasingly comprehensive. In this process, Richard also uncovered more information about previous complaints Barnes had caused. Many of Barnes's past victims came forward, ready to share their experiences and willing to testify in court. With strong documentation and evidence in hand, Richard was confident he could bring this case into the public eye. Richard went further, proposing a comprehensive investigation into instances of abuse of power and concealment of misconduct within the local police force. He worked with higher authorities to ensure that not only Barnes, but any officer who had misused their power would be held accountable. In doing so, he hoped to create a fairer, more transparent system to protect the rights of all citizens. A few days later, Officer Ramirez, who had intervened to stop Barnes that day, arrived at Richard's office. He looked tense, but his eyes showed determination, knowing that his testimony would play a crucial role in the case. Ramirez spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with disappointment. "Mr. Grant, I want to make it clear that I do not condone what Barnes did. Although I've worked with him, that day he crossed every line, disregarding the lives of others and ignoring emergency protocols." Richard nodded, his gaze serious and encouraging. "I appreciate your willingness to testify. I know this isn't easy, but your testimony will make a tremendous difference." Ramirez took a deep breath, looking at Richard as if to ensure he was truly listening to every word. "I received a call about a disturbance involving an ambulance. When I arrived at the scene, I saw Barnes blocking the ambulance and behaving aggressively toward the rescue team and the victim's husband. He had taken the situation far beyond any rule or ethics we are sworn to uphold." Richard listened intently, his hands clenched in restrained anger. "So you witnessed Barnes violating basic protocols in an emergency?" Ramirez nodded firmly, continuing, "Exactly, sir. An ambulance must never be obstructed when handling an emergency. I tried to persuade him to step aside, but Barnes refused to listen. I had no choice but to intervene to ensure the safety of that woman." Leaning forward, Richard's voice was resolute and full of conviction. "Thank you, Ramirez. You did the right thing, and your testimony will be crucial in holding this man accountable. Justice must be served, and thanks to your courage, we are one step closer to that." As Ramirez left, Richard sat for a moment, deep in thought. The genuine and responsible testimony from the officer strengthened his resolve. With this testimony in the video evidence, Richard knew that the case against Barnes was now built on a solid foundation. His faith in justice had never been stronger, and he vowed to fight to the end to protect his family and uphold what was right. The official court date was announced, and the news reignited the media. All eyes turned to Richard and his legal team, anticipating a fair trial. Social organizations, human rights advocates, and countless citizens called for systemic reform. Richard's determination and resolve became an inspiration to the community. In his office, Richard looked at the family photo on his desk, where Jessica held his tiny grandson. A warm yet resolute feeling rose within him. This fight was not just for his family, but for justice for those without a voice in society. Finally, the day of Barnes's trial arrived. The courthouse was packed early in the morning, with the media covering the event and a large crowd gathered outside, holding signs demanding justice for Jessica and her child, calling for transparency and fairness in the police system. The name Barnes had become a symbol of abuse of power, and this trial was seen as a test to determine if justice would truly be served. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Richard Grant, serving as the lead prosecutor, entered the courtroom with a determined expression. He was not only representing his family, but also standing for everyone who had suffered from abuse of power. The evidence and testimonies had been meticulously prepared, and his legal team had worked tirelessly to ensure that the truth would be revealed as clearly as possible. Barnes sat at the defendant's table, his face tense but maintaining a composed appearance. Beside him, his defense attorney whispered in his ear, trying to reassure him and strategize his defense. However, Barnes avoided looking in the direction of Jessica's family, a fact noticed by everyone in the room. Richard began with a powerful opening statement, detailing what had happened the night Barnes blocked the ambulance. He emphasized that this was not an isolated incident or a mere error in judgment by Barnes, but part of a long history of abuses of power that had been covered up for years. He promised to bring the truth to light and urged the jury to deliberate carefully to protect the fairness and safety of the community. Following Richard's opening remarks, the prosecution began calling key witnesses to the stand to testify. First up was Tom, the paramedic whom Barnes had assaulted. Tom took the stand, his face calm but his eyes filled with resolve. "Please recount in detail what happened that night," Richard requested. Tom took a deep breath and began recounting everything. He described Jessica's critical condition, the urgency of the medical team to get her to the hospital, and how Barnes had brutally obstructed them on the way. "When I tried to explain the situation, he wouldn't listen and instead demanded to check our paperwork. When I pleaded with him, he became angry and even hit me," Tom said, his voice breaking slightly as he recalled the anger and helplessness of that moment. Tom's testimony left the courtroom silent for a moment. The bystander's cell phone video was then shown on the screen, capturing the moment Barnes punched Tom and threatened him. Gasps of shock filled the room as everyone watched Barnes's violent actions unfold on the screen. The jury watched the footage intently, their faces reflecting both displeasure and indignation. Next, Daniel was called to testify. He looked at Barnes with no hint of sympathy, and his recounting of his desperation as he watched his wife suffer on the stretcher added to the tension. Daniel recounted that he had repeatedly begged Barnes to let them pass, but the officer only responded with coldness and threats. "She's my wife, the mother of our child. I can't believe someone whose duty is to protect would put us in such danger," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion, moving many in the courtroom. Then Officer Ramirez and Robert, who had witnessed Barnes's behavior that night, were called to the stand. Both confirmed that Barnes had acted unacceptably and that they had felt compelled to intervene to prevent the situation from worsening. It was clear that Barnes's actions were not only dangerous, but also grossly violated the rights of victims in need of emergency care, Ramirez stated firmly. The witness testimonies painted a clear picture of Barnes's abuse of power, but the prosecution had even more evidence to present. Richard proceeded to display previous complaint files against Barnes, showing that the officer had a long history of misconduct, including allegations of intimidation, assault, and blatant disregard for citizens. Each page of these files only added weight to the case, proving that this was not a random incident, but the result of a long-standing pattern of protected and concealed misconduct. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the public continued their protest. They held up signs with slogans like "Justice for Jessica" and "End Abuse of Power Now." Many called for police reform, demanding transparency and accountability from law. Enforcement. Public outrage grew as more details about Barnes's past were revealed, and they chanted continuously for justice. Back in the courtroom, Barnes's defense lawyer attempted to mitigate his client's actions. He argued that Barnes was simply doing his job and that he had misunderstood the situation. My client was only trying to ensure traffic safety, and he had no intention of causing harm, the lawyer said, but his argument seemed weak against the solid evidence and testimonies presented by the prosecution. Richard stood to deliver his closing statement. He turned to the jury, his gaze unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a flagrant abuse of power, and Barnes endangered the lives of a mother and her unborn child. His arrogance and lack of empathy are not just personal failings. They are a threat to our society if left unchecked. He ended with a powerful appeal to the jury. You have the right and you have the responsibility. Let justice be served, not only for my family, but for the safety and fairness of everyone in this community. Don't allow someone like Barnes to continue harming others. The courtroom fell silent after Richard's closing statement. Each member of the jury bowed their heads, deep in thought, while outside the crowd continued to chant, "Justice for Jessica." Finally, the jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations, while everyone in the courtroom waited in tense anticipation for the verdict. After a few minutes of deliberation, the jury returned to their seats. As the judge began reading the verdict, the entire courtroom fell silent, everyone holding their breath in anticipation. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, the jury has unanimously found the defendant, Barnes, guilty on charges of abuse of power, obstruction of emergency medical services, and assault on a duty-bound individual. These actions not only endangered the lives of the victims, but also severely damaged the community's trust in law enforcement. The judge paused, directing a cold gaze at Barnes. Therefore, for these offenses, the court sentences the defendant, Barnes, to 8 years in prison and a permanent ban from any position within law enforcement. The verdict echoed through the courtroom, and a murmur immediately arose. Some in the room applauded, while others sighed in relief, feeling that justice had finally been served. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, this sentence was the result of relentless efforts from the community and the determination of Richard Grant, who had steadfastly pursued justice for his family. Barnes, his face ashen, bowed his head as he listened to his sentence. All of his lawyer's attempts to defend and excuse him could not alter the undeniable truth of his actions on that fateful night. Officers escorted Barnes out of the courtroom, while a few people stood and applauded, celebrating the triumph of justice. Richard Grant stepped outside the courthouse, where a large crowd still gathered. When he appeared, people began cheering and clapping. Cries of "Justice has been served" filled the air, and many held signs expressing their support for Richard. He was not only representing Jessica's family, but had become a symbol of perseverance, determination, and faith in justice. In a brief press conference after the trial, Richard stood before a crowd of cameras and reporters, speaking with calm but powerful conviction. Today, we've taken a significant step in protecting the rights and safety of our community. No one, regardless of the uniform they wear, has the right to abuse their power and endanger the lives of innocent citizens. I hope this serves as a lesson not only for those in positions of authority, but also as a reminder that the system must change to prevent similar incidents. The story of Barnes and his sentencing quickly became a landmark case in the fight for accountability and reform within the police system. Human rights organizations and social activists used this case as a call for more comprehensive reforms in the justice and police systems. Politicians and influencers also spoke out, advocating for stronger measures to prevent abuse of power and enhance oversight of law enforcement conduct. In the weeks that followed, proposals for police reform were widely discussed. Under pressure from the public and social organizations, local authorities committed to thoroughly reviewing the complaint handling process and increasing transparency in internal investigations. Many officers and other public officials felt a renewed sense of responsibility to fulfill their duties more earnestly, understanding that the community's trust was at stake. The story of Barnes's case and Richard Grant's fight was broadcast by national news outlets, becoming a prime example of Jessica's family's resilience and the community's unity. Public discussions and media dialogues about police misconduct began to appear more frequently, from news articles and interviews to legal reform symposiums. After the trial concluded, Richard returned to the hospital, where Jessica and his newborn grandson were still recovering. He entered the room and saw his daughter resting peacefully, her face no longer pale and pained as before. Daniel sat beside Jessica, his eyes shining with joy and relief. When she saw her father, Jessica smiled weakly, her eyes filled with gratitude. Richard approached, gently taking Jessica's hand. "It's over, sweetheart. Justice has been served," he whispered, his gaze warm and filled with love. Jessica held his hand tightly, her voice weak but steady. "Thank you, Dad, for standing by me. Because of you, my son and I were protected." Richard looked down at his tiny grandson in the crib, feeling a swell of happiness mixed with resolve. He knew that this fight was not only for his family, but for a safer future for everyone. He smiled, knowing that his journey had brought justice and would help prevent future abuses of power. The story of Richard Grant's fight for justice became a symbol of courage and faith in the legal system. It not only inspired his family and the community, but marked a turning point in demanding accountability from those in positions of authority. From then on, people believed even more strongly that, despite any challenges, justice was always worth protecting and fighting for to the very end. As the pressures and tensions of the fight for justice began to fade, Jessica's small family embarked on a new journey, a journey of healing and recovery. During their initial days in the hospital, Jessica faced pain and exhaustion after her surgery, but her gentle, loving gaze at her tiny son was always warm and steady. He was a testament to her strength, courage, and the unwavering love of her entire family. Daniel was constantly by Jessica's side, caring for her and encouraging her every day. In those first few nights, he stayed awake, watching Jessica and their son's every breath, unwilling to leave them even for a moment. Each time he saw their son smile, move his tiny hands, or sleep peacefully with sparkling eyes, he felt a joy that only those who have endured hardship together can understand. In every tender gesture Daniel showed toward his wife and child, those around him could see his boundless love and appreciation for his family. One sunny afternoon, Richard Grant visited his daughter and grandson in the hospital. His heart felt lighter seeing Jessica's gradual recovery, her face brighter and more full of life. Richard stepped into the room, gently embracing Jessica and leaning down to kiss his tiny grandson on the forehead, his heart swelling with happiness. It was a moment when he realized that all the hardships, struggles, and sacrifices were worth it to see his family safe and happy. "Jessica, you've been so brave," Richard whispered, his voice warm and full of emotion. "Every day I prayed to see you and the baby get through what happened. And now, seeing you both healthy, I know our family is truly blessed." Jessica squeezed her father's hand, her eyes sparkling with joy and gratitude. "Dad, because of you, we made it through everything. You stood up for me, for my child, and I don't know how to thank you enough." Her voice faltered, but her smile remained radiant, shining in her eyes, filled with love and appreciation. In the quiet hospital room, the space was filled with love as the family sat together, sharing peaceful moments after the storm. Daniel held Jessica tightly, their hands intertwined, as if he would never let go. The baby slept soundly in his mother's arms, occasionally wrinkling his nose or gripping Jessica's finger, bringing gentle smiles to everyone's faces. The next day, the doctors announced that Jessica and her son could go home. The day the family left the hospital, golden sunlight streamed through the trees outside, as if welcoming them back to a life of peace. As they stepped through the hospital doors, Jessica, Daniel, and Richard felt a wave of relief and indescribable joy. The family had overcome the greatest challenge of their lives, and now they could enjoy complete happiness together. Back at home, Jessica sat by the window, holding her son in her arms and looking out over the garden. The familiar view of the garden with its trees and flowers gently reminded her that they had returned to what was simple and beloved. Daniel prepared a small meal to celebrate their reunion, and the family gathered together in a warm atmosphere. They laughed and shared memories and feelings from their journey, savoring the deep love and joy of each moment. One evening, as Daniel rocked their son to sleep, he looked at Jessica and said, "We've been through so much, but looking at you and our son now, I feel it was all worth it. From now on, I just want to take care of and protect you both so that every day is peaceful." Jessica smiled softly, nodding and whispering, "All I need is you and our son. We've weathered the storm, and now it's time to build a new life filled with love and hope." Richard visited them often, bringing small gifts for his grandson and always making time to sit with Jessica, talking about what they had gone through and the things awaiting them in the future. In Richard's eyes, each time he saw Jessica holding his grandson, he felt an indescribable happiness. He knew this family would always be strong, never yielding to adversity. And so their lives gradually returned to a peaceful rhythm. Jessica and Daniel cared for their little boy together, each day filled with smiles, laughter, and the warmth of true family life. The child grew, healthy and full of life, a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that family love and unity could overcome any hardship. Their journey was not only a fight for justice, but also a story of love, perseverance, and faith in goodness. Each day, as Jessica saw her son smile in her arms, she remembered all the challenges they had faced and felt stronger than ever. She knew she was living not just for herself, but for her family, for the love they had given each other throughout the journey. The family looked toward a bright future with new dreams and hopes. They knew that no matter the challenges, they would always have each other and always be a strong support for one another. In their hearts, love, courage, and faith in justice would be timeless values passed down to future generations, like a light guiding them forward. In the end, Officer Barnes paid the price for his violent actions and for endangering lives. This story reminds us of the power of unity and justice. What do you think of how the family and everyone fought for what was right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more meaningful stories. See you next time.